Welcome to week 5 of our Samuel study series. Today we are actually going to be jumping forward quite a bit to the first chapter of 2 Samuel. In order for us to appreciate what's going on in this passage, of course, we have to do all of the background work of catching up from 1 Samuel chapter 18 all the way up to the end of 1 Samuel. So that's what we'll be doing in the majority of this video, and then we will give some overlaying thoughts about the ideas and themes presented in 2 Samuel chapter 1. But without further ado, let's go ahead and grab your notebook, grab your pen, and let's get ready. So let's begin just by flying chapter by chapter and doing a 30,000 foot view when we can, and zooming in a little bit more when we can. 1 Samuel chapter 18. Here we are introduced to the very close relationship, the friendship between David and Jonathan. Jonathan happens to be the son of Saul, but early on, Jonathan acknowledges David's anointing and his future kingship. And Jonathan is deeply committed to this friendship with David. David is still a harpist in the house of Saul, but Saul keeps David around primarily because of his close relationship with Jonathan. But David begins to show himself and his worth in more than just being a harpist. He begins leading and winning military victories. And very quickly, the people of Israel begin to know David as a military champion, a victorious general, if you will. And Saul becomes very suspicious and jealous of David's popularity. Also in this chapter, David marries Saul's daughter, Michal. In 1 Samuel chapter 19, we see that Saul is spurred on by this evil spirit, this bad spirit within him, and he tries to attack David. He does this out of fear, out of anger, out of jealousy, and he tries to kill David, which at this point, David is a very important person in the eyes of Israel, in the eyes of his son, even in the eyes of Saul. But regardless, Saul attacks him. I think to kind of see what's going on here, we need to compare the character portrait of Saul to the character portrait of the Pharaoh back in Exodus. Just like the Pharaoh who had his heart hardened after over and over again choosing to deny passage of the Israelites to go into the wilderness to worship Yahweh. Here Saul, because of his rebellion, his disobedience against Yahweh, he is kind of trapped in this state of experiencing the consequence of that rebellion. And he is doing things that just don't make sense. And he is just stuck in a state of fear. 1 Samuel chapters 21 and 22 starts to introduce us to David fleeing from Saul and going into exile in the wilderness. With the help of Jonathan, David escapes from Saul's presence at the court of the king, and he begins to go on the run. And we immediately get a couple stories that show us perhaps questionable decisions that David makes. First, he deceives a priest so that he can have some food in order for him and his band of loyal followers to actually have food while they're on the run. And then immediately after this, David acts crazy before a king so that he doesn't get killed because he's afraid that the king is going to somehow harm him because of David's reputation. There's a lot going on here that we don't have time to unpack, but I think what we need to recognize is that these are just some early glimpses that remind us of David's imperfection. He is a human, and he is not impervious to fear. And in these chapters, while he's on the run from Saul, and later on as well, he begins to do things that may seem questionable to us. And we have to reflect on these passages before we begin to find a satisfying conclusion on the character portrait of David. Right after this, in 1 Samuel chapter 22, we begin to get a little bit of insight of the following that David has accumulated. It's those who are frustrated, who are not content with the state of Israel and the kingship. Those are the ones who are following David. And in this passage, we find out a little bit more about why someone might feel that way. Hearing that the priest even unknowingly assisted David, Saul has that priest, his family, and the entire priest city of Nob slaughtered. These are priests of Yahweh, they're Levites, and Saul has them all killed. This is by far the worst thing that Saul has done so far. He is killing the mediators of God's presence and blessing. He has turned against his own people. While Saul is murdering his people, David is on the run, and he actually encounters the Philistines. And while in the wilderness, while on the run from Saul, he and his band of followers have a military victory over the Philistines. Yahweh is still preserving him. He is still presented as someone who is fighting on behalf of God's people. And once again, Saul is acting here very foolishly and unwise. We might ask ourselves why. We just need to remember, think back to the Pharaoh in Egypt. Saul is experiencing the ultimate consequences of his rebellion. He lives in a state of fear and disobedience, a state of foolishness, just like he was before. And now, as he's pursuing David in the wilderness, exhausting his own energy and his troops' energy, David is having military victories against the Philistines. In 1 Samuel chapter 24, we come to a story that may be familiar to you. David is in the wilderness, he's in a cave, and Saul unknowingly goes into that cave to go to the bathroom, and David chooses to spare Saul's life. He cuts off a corner of Saul's garment, and after Saul leaves, David goes out and he says, "I could have killed you, but I didn't. Look, here's the hem of your robe. I cut it off. I've spared your life. What have I done against you?" And Saul, realizing his foolishness, repents of his actions, acknowledges that David is the righteous one, that he will one day be king, that Yahweh is going to give him everything. And then he asks David to make a covenant promise with Saul that when David becomes king, he's not going to destroy Saul's family. David does this. He makes this agreement with Saul. And this would have been surprising to ancient people. It was a normal practice when a new king entered into the throne that he would kill all of the relatives of the previous king in order to consolidate power, to prevent any power plays or any old alliances that may have been created with that family. And David says, "I'm not going to do this." This is not surprising for us, the reader, because we have the insight to David's integrity. David is not the kind of person who would lay a hand against the anointed one or his family. So David says he's not going to do that. He's going to spare Saul's family when he one day becomes king. In 1 Samuel chapter 25, we may have forgotten about him, but Samuel, this whole time he's been alive and he dies in this passage. It's very brief. We just find out that he died, and we hear about the city that he died in. Right after this, we get a really strange account that essentially presents a woman that becomes David's wife. This is a little bit unusual because David was already married to Saul's daughter, Michal, but then we find out that she had actually been given to another man by Saul after marrying David, so she was kind of David's wife, but also kind of not. But then we also hear that David took another woman. At this point forward in the story, over the next 5 chapters or so, the author narrates in a way that describes David as having 2 wives. The new wife and the other one that he takes, not Michal. And this is really strange that we would have this note in the text. Like we identified early on back in Deuteronomy, it was important that the king wasn't a kind of person who took multiple wives. And the author is silent on the issue here. And I think what's happening here is the author is inviting us to reflect on these stories. Already, the author has proven that they want us to be familiar with the rest of the Bible. I think here we're getting early clues once again that David isn't the one. We had such a promising start, and we're just seeing imperfections on the way here, things that he didn't do right as we continue getting closer to David being on the throne. But once again, the author is silent on this issue, and we're just invited to keep reading and keep reflecting on the actions of David. Are they right or are they wrong? In 1 Samuel chapter 26, we have yet another famous story of David sparing Saul's life. Saul's army has been chasing David again through the wilderness. One night, as Saul was asleep and his whole camp was asleep, David and another person sneak into the camp. They steal Saul's spear and his water jug, and then they leave. In the morning, David goes out and he shows the water jug and the spear. Once again, says to Saul, "I could have killed you, but I didn't. I have nothing against you. I've never tried to harm you. I've never done any wrong to you." Saul here once again repents of his actions and then leaves David alone. What we see is another example of the reverence that David holds for the life of God's anointed one. In David's mind, Saul, even though he has been rejected by Yahweh, at one point was acknowledged by Yahweh as the person to lead God's people. Because of that, in David's mind, in his eyes, the only person who has a right to end the life of this anointed one is Yahweh. Yahweh is the only one who has the right to take the life of Saul. David will do nothing, but will trust in God's timing and providence to bring forth the events that are right and just. In 1 Samuel chapter 27, we get another strange story of David. Convinced that Saul will never stop pursuing him, David flees, not just to a random place or people group, he flees to the Philistines. And here, he convinces the king of the Philistines that he is the king's ally. And it seems here that he's being deceptive in order to preserve his own life. We have to remember also, early in 1 Samuel, the Philistines are presented as the enemy of God's people. It just seems off that David here would choose to ally himself with that people group because of Saul and because of Saul's constant pursuit of him. This may raise a few questions in our head. Can a righteous person deceive someone else in order to preserve their life, or does that show a lack of trust in Yahweh? If Yahweh has preserved David so far every single time that Saul has pursued him or tried to harm him, why is David here doing something so drastic in order to preserve his own life? Does this show mistrust of Yahweh, or does this actually show wisdom on David's behalf in order to take responsibility of his situation and do something? Once again, the author here is simply silent. We simply have to read and reread and reflect and meditate. These are complicated stories with complicated people who have complicated emotions and motives. It doesn't mean that everything they do is always 100% right or 100% wrong. And that's part of what makes it so challenging. But here, once again, we have, at the very least, a story that begins to make us question and wonder, why is David doing what he is doing? In chapters 28 through 31, we get to the last few chapters of 1 Samuel, and it's some of the strangest bit of narrative so far in the story. First, the Philistines go up in battle against the Israelites. And here, David makes it very clear to the king of the Philistines that he is going to be fighting with the Philistines. Now, it makes sense here. The commanders and the generals of the Philistine army say, no way, we remember David. He has been conquering our people since all the way back in chapter 17 when he killed Goliath. We don't trust this guy. Are you serious? He's going to turn on us the second that we start fighting against Israel. Send him back. And so the king says, I'm going to send you back. And David doesn't understand why, but he eventually does. And once again, we have here questionable motives. What would David have done in a battle against God's own people? Would he have turned on the king that he promised to be an ally with? Or would he have fought against the anointed one of God? David is kind of spared from this dilemma, and he is sent away. But in this story, as Saul goes up against the Philistines, we see once again that Saul is trembling with fright. He is extremely afraid. And because of this, he does something extraordinarily rash, which is in line with Saul's character so far. In fact, Saul does something that was commanded all the way back in the Torah that no one should ever do. Saul consults a medium in order to speak with Samuel. That is, Saul hires someone who can speak and summon the spirits of the dead in order to speak with Samuel, who's been dead for a few chapters at this point. And the strangest thing is that it works. And it's recorded here that Saul has a conversation with Samuel from beyond the grave. I want to be very clear that this is not a made-up story. Some of us may be tempted to pocket it away as just one of those bizarre stories in the Bible. I'm not going to think about it, or even a fairy tale, something that maybe didn't happen. We've just got a little more detail because the author was getting a little carried away. I don't think either of those things should be our end result here. I think we need to take this passage seriously for what it is. Now, the reason why Yahweh took this kind of sorcery so seriously was obvious to ancient people. And I think we need a reminder in a lot of Christian circles in America, because I think we have forgotten to take this kind of witchcraft seriously. There are spiritual forces in this world. Jesus knew this. Paul knew this. The early church knew this. The global church knows this. But since the post-Enlightenment age, Americans have largely forgotten this. A medium isn't a superhero. The ability to speak with people that are dead is not a gift that comes from God. God is the God of the living, not the dead. The ability to do this comes from some otherworldly source. And this isn't a source or a power that we understand, but we can classify it confidently as not good. God does not play with the spirits of people who have passed. And so we must ask ourselves, why on earth would Saul do this? And I think at last we see the epitome of Saul's fear, of his selfishness, and of his rebellion against God. He even disguises himself so that when he goes to the medium, that no one will know it's him, because he knows that this is something that he was not supposed to be doing. The ironic thing here is that when Samuel's spirit is summoned and he starts to talk to Saul, he basically repeats the same things that were told to Saul all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 15. God has taken the kingship from Saul. He is going to rip it from him. And in fact, Samuel foretells Saul that the very next day in the battle against the Philistines, Saul's life is going to be taken. At this point, Saul becomes terrified to the point of death. And the end of 1 Samuel shows us the gruesome and grisly death of Saul as the Philistines are approaching. His death is as dishonorable and sad as his story would come to make you expect. And his death brings us the end of 1 Samuel. What will happen now that there is a clear path to the throne for David? We will once again be surprised by David's actions as we enter into 2 Samuel. So that brings us to 2 Samuel chapter 1. I'm very sorry we simply don't have time to read the text today. So I'd encourage you to read it in your own time or pause the video and read it so that you can understand the text a little bit better. I'm only going to briefly overview a couple different things about this text before we end the video and move on to next week's video. The first thing that I want to highlight here is that the distinction between 1 and 2 Samuel is not real. Originally in Hebrew, it was known as one book of Samuel. It was actually on two different scrolls because the narrative was so long, but it was referenced as Samuel. When it was translated into Greek, it then received the names of 1 and 2 Samuel respectively, and then that's where our current tradition in the church and the English translations comes from. That's why we call it 1 and 2 Samuel. It is a unified work. When we begin to view it like this, the structure of Samuel becomes much more clear. The author has strategically placed songs in the beginning, the middle, and the end that reflect on the same ideas. Remember back to Hannah's song, she sang about the humble Messiah, the one who is going to be raised up, a Messiah who God will bring victory. And then we enter into the time of Saul. King Saul immediately looks promising, but he fails ultimately to be that Messiah that Hannah had sung about, the Messiah that we are expecting. And then when we get to today's text, David, when he hears the news, surprisingly, he doesn't sing about how terrible Saul was to him. He laments the life and death of Saul. We have here a transition point in the story that propels us into the next section where we follow David's kingship. But here we reflect back on the kingship of Saul and we are lamenting because it failed. Moving forward, we go into the time of King David, and at the end of 2 Samuel, David sings two songs that reminisce back on his kingship the themes of Messiah, the themes of victory, and looks forward and anticipates the future descendants of David who will have an eternal kingdom and what that kingdom will look like. So this threefold structure is really important, and here we are in a transition passage that, remember, it's not really the beginning of 2 Samuel, it's in the middle of Samuel, and it's transitioning us into a new kingship. I also want to highlight the friendship between David and Jonathan. It has been a historically famous friendship, and in recent scholarly traditions and also just contemporary voices, it also has been brought to light, especially in light of certain movements in the last 10 or 15 years or so. So essentially, the story so far has shown that they are very close. David and Jonathan actually create multiple covenants with one another, something that in the ancient world would have made them kin, would have made them like brothers, and that's exactly how the Bible describes their relationship. They also, we're told, they kiss one another. This shouldn't make us feel off or strange. This is something that fathers do to their sons, that brothers do to each other. Yes, it also is the same word for romantic kissing, but in the Bible, it is not always used that way. In fact, oftentimes it's used in familial connections. We also need to remember that this is an ancient Eastern culture where embracing and kissing each other was a common practice. It's not something that necessarily denoted a romantic affection. The last thing that I want to mention here is that in the song, David mentions Jonathan and he weeps for his deep friendship and the brother-like relationship that he had with Jonathan. David Firth, in his commentary on Samuel, actually reflects very briefly on the idea of what if Jonathan and David did have a romantic relationship, and I want to read that very briefly here. In spite of the reference to the love of women, Jonathan's love for David was not homoerotic. But Jonathan had absolute political commitment to him, demonstrated through his enabling David to escape in 1 Samuel 20 and the constant covenant making between them. Jonathan's love for David was deep and abiding, of a different type to that of women. This love was prepared to sacrifice personal gain for a friend, surrendering a claim to the throne for the one recognized as more fitted to the role. Historically, textually, and biblically, it makes most sense for us to understand these characters as having a brother-like relationship and nothing more. David loved Jonathan, and Jonathan loved David. If it wasn't for Jonathan, David would not have been able to escape from Saul. He wouldn't have had an inside voice helping protect him. And Jonathan was, by rights, the heir to the throne of Israel. He was the one who would have received the kingship after Saul had died, but he forfeits any claim that he might have and devotes himself wholly to David and his future as king. Because of this, David and Jonathan have a unique relationship, and it makes perfect sense that David would weep and lament the death of his best friend. Here we have a transition passage, and David is about to be propelled into the kingship. What kind of king is David going to be? Is he going to be like Saul, who ultimately fails? Or is he the Messiah that we've been waiting for? Once again, we must simply just keep reading and studying before we can find out. But that brings us to the end of today's video.